I am the global coordinator for the New Deal for Nature and People. The idea that we can transform our economies, our societies, to protect and restore nature, and also help contribute and tackle the fight on climate change as well. Now, I think today is, to me, feels a very special day. As we sit in here, world leaders are gathered, just a few halls down, and in a very kind of unprecedented way, with some real unstoppable momentum on climate change. We're all very, very familiar, I hope, by now, with climate science, with what it means to our well-being, what it means to the global economy, what it means to society, and the very existential threat that it creates to humanity as well. What we'd really like to discuss today is how does that link to nature? What we're seeing and what we have been seeing in the last decade is a real movement growing on climate change to create that momentum that we have today. We're starting to see that on nature as well, but we know that the numbers are really disturbing, whether that is 1 million species facing extinction, whether that is 68% of wildlife populations that have declined since 1970, and whether that is the impacts on nature to human health. The pandemic that we face right now has its roots in nature loss. We are feeling the impacts of the loss of nature globally and locally and in our lives as well. I think as we again draw lessons from the climate movement, the faith movement has been there and raising its voice for many years now, and that is really encouraging. These issues can no longer be technical issues or environmental issues. They have to be embraced by the whole of society. And the faith movement has been on the leading edge of raising that voice. And increasingly we're seeing a strong and distinct voice for nature as well, which is really the theme of today's discussion. In fact, just a few weeks ago in Marseille at the World Conservation Congress, we saw more than 100 organizations sign on to a call to action with a very simple idea at the center of it. The idea that the world should become nature positive. There should be more nature in the world in the next decade than there is at the start of this decade. And that is an idea. Who could disagree with that idea? But of course, the metrics are going in the wrong direction now. But the good news is that youth organizations have signed that call, and ever more of the youth organizations are, women's organizations, humanitarian development organizations, arts collectives, the list goes on. So that mainstreaming and that kind of whole of society idea is really starting to take hold. And it's with that that I'm personally very, very encouraged. What we're going to talk about today is the role of the faith community. We've got some incredible speakers lined up here to bring different perspectives. We're going to explore the theological and philosophical basis of the crisis that we are in. We're going to talk about the reorientation that humanity needs to be able to face this crisis. It's not just a technical crisis, it's a human crisis, and there's also a spiritual crisis at the heart of it as well. And we're also going to explore a little bit how faith leaders are increasingly becoming advocates and leaders to help put us on a different path, one where we actually find that we can live in harmony with nature and not in competition with nature. Now, COP26 is very important here, but it is not the only big multilateral agreement that can help us get us out of this mess. We have big expectations for COP26, as we should, and for the climate and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. But equally important is the Convention on Biological Diversity as well. It will come together with governments next April, May. It will put together an action plan for the next 8 to 10 years for nature, given the fact that when we talk about climate change, about 1/3 of the effort that is needed on climate change is not through renewable energy and decarbonization or electric vehicles. They are essential and important, but it is through nature. And the nature agenda has been a little bit left behind. It needs to accelerate. So a really strong outcome in Kunming next year could help us chart a different course for nature to both contribute to helping tackle climate change and fight climate change, but also for nature and the services it gives to people, and also for the intrinsic right of nature to exist, to thrive, to survive as well. So that's a lot of ground to cover in the minutes remaining. So with that introduction, I'm going to introduce the speakers just one by one and call a question on each, and we'll run down the line. Then we're going to have a couple more questions for discussion and invite a couple of questions from the audience as well. We do have a live audience in the camera over here, so please, speakers, say hi to them when we're speaking as well. It's been live streamed around the world and it's been well promoted. And with that, I'd first like to introduce our first speaker, which is Karina Gore, on the end here. You are the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics in New York City. And as your center approaches this work with a focus on ethics, how can we understand or explain the climate and biodiversity crisis through the lens of ethics? Please, 4 minutes of thinking on this, and a microphone will appear. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much. Thank you to the conveners and hosts of this wonderful event, and I appreciate very much and am honored to be a part of it. Yes, ethics it's really the discernment of right and wrong and the implications for human behavior, individually and collectively. And so often when we're discussing these issues, sometimes our language and our way of talking reinforces the idea that human beings and nature are separate. And of course, that is an illusion. And the climate crisis is part of waking up to that illusion. And ethics is really about the relationship between human beings and the rest of the natural world when we're talking about biodiversity and climate. And so as faith voices have expressed in different ways, we don't need to fix nature so much as fix our behavior towards nature. And I think, to keep it brief, that faith communities have a lot to offer here. Over roughly 80% of the world has some sense of religious belonging in which they find a way to perceive and discern moral obligation. And it has a countercultural force. We now know that, of course, we're living with the result of a value system in which development has come at the expense of nature and at the expense of justice towards certain peoples, poor peoples, and future generations of all people. And I think what faith communities can offer, I'll lift up three concepts to change our way of thinking about time, place, and being. Time, we obviously need to be thinking longer term than many political leaders are naturally inclined to do because of who they're responsive to. And we need to be also aware of the present moment, because we hear these timelines set up 2030, 2050, and sometimes those too are used as a kind of illusion that we can put this off. So time in terms of long term, but also the present. And this is a metaphysical exercise that faith leaders certainly have some specialty in. Place is important in the same way that we see the political conversation being a little skewed around the notion of time. We also see place, that sometimes very good commitments that are being made are made on the basis of offsets that are planting trees elsewhere rather than dealing with the land within the political place that the nation is dealing with. This is very important because that relationship to place is exactly what needs to be restored. And so on that level, we want people in terms of the political leaders to connect to their own place, as well as asking faith communities to connect more deeply to place. And finally, being. Being goes to the value system, and it is obviously the case that we have had a value system that has put an emphasis on individuality, materialism, this sense of progress that has to do with getting more stuff. And that's often attached to a kind of status that doesn't really align with happiness. And so it's important, as the Earth Charter, for example, stated, that we have a concept of development in which human development is about being more, not having more. And in that sense, of course, faith and spiritual traditions have often been the source of sacred texts and teachings, ritual and ceremony, and gatherings to kind of shift that consciousness. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak a little bit about that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karina. Thank you. Let's come back to time, place, and being as well. There's some really interesting framing there that we can draw and drill a little bit deeper on. Let's hear next from Dan Perel. Dan is the UN representative for the Baha'i international community. The Baha'i UN office works a lot to support and encourage multilateral engagement at the UN. Given the current challenges to the multilateral system, Dan, question for you. What can we draw from Baha'i teachings in order to come together to address climate change and to protect nature?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gavin, and thank you to those here and joining from afar. It's really a pleasure to be having this conversation. I think there are three, I'll build off what Karina said, with three elements. I think that number is very helpful, that maybe I wish to try and contribute. The first is the concept of unity and diversity. Now, we've all heard the phrase, but actually determining what it means in a multilateral context may be a bit more complicated. The second is settled consensus. So moving beyond mere consensus to actually settling it to change our behavior. And then the third is a learning approach. So firstly, on unity and diversity, we treat diversity in the multilateral space often as a source of competition. So if country X is doing one thing, country Y tries to one-up or undermine what they're doing because there's this fixed pie mentality. But if we see diversity as a source of strength and see in the success of another country or another people's as a victory for ourselves as well, then I think that would be a great advancement. And what this means in the area of the natural world is actually different to what it means in the area of climate change. So climate change is shared all over the world. Emissions in one place directly affect the climate in another, whereas nature often is more isolated. It requires diverse local efforts with a unified ultimate objective of saving species and the like. But because species are so geographically local, there may be diverse approaches necessary. And that should actually be embraced rather than undermined. The second is this idea of settled consensus. And I think religion here has a lot to offer because any adherent to a religious belief has achieved some degree of consensus with other adherents of that religious belief. Now, how that is applied in their day-to-day life may vary, but once it is settled consensus, like we all agree that if I took my phone and dropped it, it would be a bad thing, so I won't do that. So when we settle a consensus about climate change or about the value of nature, it affects our behavior. I won't drop my phone. I also will be more conscientious about what I choose to eat. And the third is about a learning approach. We do not have the answers that are the final answers. We have many approaches. We have a long menu of great ideas, and I think we require the will and the capacity to choose them. And I think that's what we're calling on world leaders to do these 2 weeks. But to say that we know for sure what the solutions are would be actually to limit our horizon. And so if we approach this in a learning process, one where we experiment with something, revisit it a few years on, and try to actually treat it not as a failed experiment, but as something to learn from, that is mimicking, in fact, the scientific process, where 99% of the efforts perhaps result in failure, in quotes, but actually from that 1% and even from the mistakes, we can learn so much. So if we treat this as a learning process, I think we will create tremendous advancement. And this is what we try to do in the Baha'i community and try to bring to the international sphere to the best of our ability. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. So next we're going to hear from Sister Jayanti. I hope I have the pronunciation exactly correct. Perfect. Good. UN representative for the Brahma Kumaris. You're well known internationally for your leadership and work on inner change and consciousness. So the question is, what shifts are you seeing and what more needs to happen for humanity to develop a different kind of relationship, a more balanced relationship with the earth?
Thank you, and thank you not just for the question, but for the opportunity of being here. So thanks to WWF and the organizers of this event. And over the last couple of years, what we've seen is that there has been a shift of consciousness generally because of the pandemic. And I'm seeing that more people are turning inwards. The two most Googled words were prayer and God in the last 18 months. And so I see this as a big step forward in our movement towards transformation. But also I'm seeing that in terms of the faith-based organizations, there's a greater consensus. If we think about theology, then theology is very, very different from east to west, north to south. But when we think about the crises that the human species is facing, then I see that all of us are united in the awareness that there has to be transformation, and it has to be on an inner level. And whatever starts inside is going to reach outside. And so I'm seeing that that shift has also been happening over the last few years. We started talking about inner consciousness impacting climate and biodiversity many years ago. But it was a few years ago that UNESCO actually had as its banner, changing minds, not climate. So I was very pleased that that concept had reached places like UNESCO, but also other people too. And I know that a big subject is the whole thing about the commercial world, consumption and all of these things, but there has to be a way to find that inner contentment which comes through spiritual values. And when there is that experience of inner contentment, then we're able to simplify our lifestyle. We're able to make the right choices in terms of not just our own physical comforts, but what it is that's good for the whole of the planet and biodiversity. Spirituality also offers this awareness that all life is sacred. And when we have that awareness of not just peace in my own mind, but peace with others, human beings, but also peace with all forms of nature, all forms of living creatures and the very elements themselves. So with this consciousness, I know that there can be a transformation so that we come together and work together for the greater good, for not just our own survival, but also something for the whole world, including the planet. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Yeah, we often talk about living in harmony with nature, but I think you put it much more eloquently than perhaps I've stated it myself in the past. Let's move on now to Gopal Patel. Gopal works with the Hindu communities through his organization Bhumi Global, which he's the co-founder and director of. He's also a good friend and ally of WWF and helps us bridge to much of the faith community as well. So thanks so much for that, Gopal, and for helping organize today's discussion. My question is, what are you hearing from Hindus in relation to climate and biodiversity?
Thank you, Gavin. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to the New Deal team and also to the Beliefs and Values program at WWF for having us. It's a good question, and it's an important question, and it's something that actually our organization set out to find out earlier this year by conducting the first ever global survey on Hindu views on the environment. That data, that information just had never been gathered before. And we got about over 500 responses in our survey. And what we found, the top 4 concerns for Hindus globally were water pollution, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and then climate change. And I found that quite interesting because climate change gets all the air in many ways. And the fact that the global Hindu community in our survey put it 4th after biodiversity really made us sit up at our organization and think, oh, this is interesting. Why is that? And I've been thinking about that quite a bit. And I think one reason is that I think we as the faith community, broadly speaking, have been able to get behind the climate agenda in many ways because it's framed as an anthropocentric issue. It's framed around saving humanity, which it rightly is. But in the Hindu world, and I would say in other Eastern traditions and and Deborah could maybe speak to this, is that the concept of the sacred in nature is so profound and so much a focus. The concept of sacred rivers, of sacred trees, of sacred mountains, that these are all persons, personalities, divine beings, that they are worshipped and have a right to life, just as humans have a right to life. Because that is such a focus in Hindu thought and Hindu identity, it made me realize it's not a surprise that biodiversity is more of a concern than climate change in the Hindu community. Because we're not just concerned about the survival of the human race, but we're concerned about the survival of the mountains and the cows and the fish and the trees. And so I think as we work in a multi-faith context around the climate issue, engaging in the biodiversity concerns is, I think in some ways, for some traditions, an easy journey, theologically, philosophically. I think for some it's a bit more of a stretch. But I think it's something that we have to do, because the focus on climate and not speaking about the biodiversity issue means that we're, as you said, cutting out 30% of the conversation or 30% of the solution. So I was really happy to see that the Hindu community is stepping up in that way and really putting biodiversity as its focus above climate change, because I think that's desperately needed.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Gopal. And last, we're going to hear from Deborah Boudreau, who's the Executive Vice President of the Buddhist Tzuchi Foundation. Your organization is engaged at the grassroots level, but also at the UN level as well, advocating for action on climate and on nature. So my question is, what from your Buddhist teachings can help us understand our current moment that we're in relation to climate and to nature? Please, Deborah.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And thank you, Karina, and all of my panelists. There's a story I want to share. 2014, when we in Peru, in a small compound, we are just talking about, sooner or later, we're going to face the climate change. That time, we have a statement say, no killing. When we say no killing, we have a lot of resistance. They say, what do you mean by no killing? Then we started to think about what will be the right terminology. So we come out to ethical eating. Then from ethical eating, people started debating, what is ethical eating? Then we have to change plant-based diet. Now people started to thinking and kicking. For Buddhists, today, we wear the mask. How soon we've been asking we're going to remove our mask. Buddhist practice, we look people, all the things happen right now, from greed, anger, frustration, negligence, and attachment to desire. The attachment desired leading to today the turmoil about the whole society, the whole Mother Earth. What we see right now, like we learn from the time, we learn from the lesson, we learn from the unity, but really people change, behavior change is coming from your daily practice. The practice started from food, clothing materials, housing, transportation. This is such a simple methodology, but all the time we pretend we know. So how we going to look into ourselves to become a good global citizens? For Buddha's teachings, we respect everyone. We mindfulness to practice to our daily life. We contribute to the climate change. Number one, we bring our own drinking cup. And this is another successful story. When I was in Germany to raise the voices, say, why COP, UNCCC events, we use styrofoam cup. But I have to salute, we changed. Today, we use recycling cup, we give recycling bottle. So the message is delivered. The implementation is really be mindfulness. Be mindfulness. And from be mindfulness, like Sister Jante say, if we all thinking at one, we move in one directions, united, we can make it happen. The crisis is here. The boat is fire. We need to find a destination to go. But the destination is beyond our imagination. However, you can control, you can manage. The harmony of the society is management by your two hands. Your two hands can make it happen. So, summarized, united into one heart. Everybody be mindful. If we move the action now, we can make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. So we've covered an awful lot of ground here, from the spiritual and the personal to the personal decisions we make, to our agency to be able to influence wider as well. Maybe we could take a step back and say, what do you see are some of the big opportunities that are unfolding? We've got an incredible wealth of experience here that have been working and advocating, encouraging on climate change, encouraging us to look in the mirror to ourselves as well. What are the personal opportunities or the big kind of timeline opportunities this week, next week, and in the next few months that you see? Would anyone like to reflect on that question? What opportunities are bound for us?
I'm seeing that all the things that have happened through this year in terms of the fires, the floods, etc., it seems to be a big shake-up and a wake-up call for humanity. And so I think people are now asking governments to do something about this. And they might not always understand between biodiversity and climate change. I think that's another step in education and raising awareness. But certainly they see the impact of what we've done to the climate and the whole cycle of nature being disrupted. And so I see this as actually a big opportunity for coming to a consensus and a decision about what steps we need to take.
Thank you. Thank you, sister. Please, Deborah.
We see the opportunity to change, the opportunity to learn what we have and do your own inventory. What do you have from your home? What do you have from yourself? What do you have from your community? From that, you stop, listen, hear, and see. Hear by using your eye to hear. See by using your ear to see. So you can really reflect what we have about the environment. So great lessons and reflect ourselves. The door is open. The opportunity is right there. Our founder, Master Zeng Yan, always saying, this is the best time to turn our wisdom into consciousness and practice with compassion. So that will be a good lesson learned from pandemic, from natural disaster, to protect our nature life.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Brilliant. Karina?
Hi. Well, there are many opportunities I wanted to highlight too. One is actually human health is so connected to the health of the planet. And we can see this specifically in several ways through climate. The same activity that is the main driver of the climate crisis, which is the burning of fossil fuels, also creates this localized pollution that harms human health. And we've seen particularly, well, around the world, but speaking from my country, the United States, a pattern which involves racism and discrimination against people who live without monetary and political power and wealth, to put these toxic facilities in those communities. And so there's an opportunity to see that we can actually take care of our neighbors and our whole society better in terms of human health as we stop the pollution causing the climate crisis. There are other health aspects as well. For instance, the food system, of course, we know is responsible for, I've seen between a quarter and a third of emissions. There's so much waste. There's also many elements in the food system where people are eating food that's making them sick because of the same industrial monocropping chemical processes that are bad for the planet in these food systems. And so we now have, of course, hunger and malnourishment is a huge problem, but obesity is increasingly a problem from these processed and poor quality foods that come from the system. So we have an opportunity in looking at the planetary health and solving that food system contribution to it to help the health of people as well. And so finally, I just think that we have an opportunity to make our value system and the way that we talk politically match the things of real value. It is so common now to hear climate change talked about in terms of the money that it costs. And it's more and more people, I think, have this reaction of, well, hang on, it's not just the money that it costs. How can you possibly calculate this just in terms of money? And so I think that it's generating a conversation in which we can talk about the value, cultural value, spiritual value, a sense of purpose and alignment in life that one can feel a peace of mind about. And so in that sense, it also goes back to health, because peace of mind, of course, is related to mental and emotional health. So those are some of the opportunities that we have.
Hey, thanks, Karina. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a plug, actually, for something that all of our organizations are working on at the moment is responding to the first draft of the Global Biodiversity Framework that the CBD have been working on for the past year or so. That's a real opportunity, and we have a group of about 60 faith-based organizations who are working around the UN system to ensure that spiritual and religious values and frameworks like Karina has been talking about and others are reflected in the new framework when it's adopted finally in Kunming in the spring. And I think that's a real opportunity, because in the current draft of the framework, we were all surprised because it talks about the world in the old ways, which is humanity and nature are separate. And nature only has value because of what it provides to us as people. And we as the faith community at the UN who have been advocating on the biodiversity framework have been pushing this narrative that framing is wrong. That framing is outdated. That framing is the framing that got us into this problem in the first place. And we need to shift to this understanding that we are interconnected, we are interdependent with nature, and nature has a right to exist just as much as we do. And that's a huge opportunity, because the framework is still being drafted. They're still open for comments and feedback. And I think as the faith community want to step up, as we have done in the climate space, there's a real opportunity there with the CBD process over the next 6 months to ensure that our values are reflected in the new framework, which will be in place for the next decade or so.
Great, thanks, Gopal.
Thank you. So, just building off of what my fellow panelists said, with which I certainly agree and would lend my voice. So far be it from me to state what future historians would write, but I suspect that there was a pattern that emerged out of the COVID pandemic, and that is that in the first part of it, before the vaccine, there were, of course, exacerbated inequalities. There were a whole host of issues, and there were also exceptional narratives that we needn't get into that were between nations in some respect. But once there was a vaccine, we saw that the human element really deepened the inequalities, deepened the divisiveness in the world, and it's now called vaccine apartheid. We have all this language around it, which I think is very reflective of an underlying unrest. But in this lies an opportunity. When we have a shared challenge, like a virus to which we need to respond, we are able actually to come together and sacrifice some of our momentary comforts for a greater good. And yet, once the human element becomes perhaps too engaged, we can really muck that up, to be kind, in a way that I think we have to reflect on and learn about. One other thing that I think emerged from the pandemic that gives me a sense of optimism is local action. We saw that we couldn't rely sufficiently on neither the global nor even the national level institutions, and we had to take action very locally. I think there's a tendency, particularly through religion, to trust the institutions and to rely on the institutions to do things that perhaps communities and individuals can just take action and do on their own. And I think we saw that during the pandemic, this real galvanizing force through social media, through friendships, through families, that is something that we can really build on. And I'm hopeful that we will take the lessons from that one space and bring it into this one and others as we collectively confront the multiple challenges that humanity is facing.
Great, thanks so much, Dan. And just reflecting on many of the responses and your thoughts that you've shared, framing is coming up quite a lot. You mentioned earlier, Karina, 2030, 2050, these are very distant dates. I've always thought that the faith community has a lot of brilliant oration, a lot of hearts and minds touched, and there's something that the wider world can learn from that, because at the end of the day, we have a persuasion challenge. That is our challenge ahead of us. So would anyone like to reflect a little bit on what we can all learn from your daily work and your daily life in your faiths? What lessons can we pull out to connect with people in a very different kind of a way so that we can persuade more quickly than perhaps we have been doing so far? Sister Jayanti, please.
I think the word love has been overused, abused, misused. And I think within spiritual awareness, and every tradition has at its heart spirituality. So within that spiritual consciousness, there's a much, much bigger understanding of love. And I think this is something that can be shared in a very positive way with the world, especially to make real what is going on. And the whole subject of values, and love is one of those values, but if we touch human hearts, whether it's love or compassion, as Deborah said, or even respect, then as people become aware that these are the things which are very simple, things that we can do in a very practical way in our lives, and it'll make a big difference, not just to us, but to all living creatures and the globe, the whole world. But we've forgotten about this, and we've really made that word love into a very narrow definition. But to open it up and just feel the love that exists in our hearts already, but to extend it to many, many others and make it more inclusive to all the creatures of the world and the planet, all the elements, and the flowers and the trees and the mountains and the seas, it could make such a huge difference.
Great, thank you. Dan, please go ahead.
So Sister Jayanti spoke eloquently of love. I would like to speak, hopefully somewhat eloquently if I can, we'll find out, about sacrifice. I think sacrifice is often understood as really giving up something profound, and it's a burden. But in fact, the definition of sacrifice is giving up that which is lower for that which is higher. And if you think that way, whenever we go out to eat and we don't order off the dessert menu, perhaps we're giving up something lower, the dessert, for something higher, the salad. Because we know, in the long run, the salad is what makes us healthier and feel better. And it sounds funny, but right now, the lower nature of the human system is about acquisition of money, of power, of all these material things. But that which is higher is about social connection, about love. And the more we can give up that which is lower for that which is higher, in fact, the less it's sacrifice, and the more it's just joy. And I think as we're able to encounter that more and more and build on that from our faith perspective and our ethical perspective and our non-belief perspectives, the more we can build on strengths of others and what is genuine and true to who we are.
Thank you, Dan. Deborah, please.
So we from love, from sacrifice, now is action. For Buddhists, we really would like to share with Sister Jayanti's message. If we can just eat 80% of your food every day, we can reserve 20%. Put those 20% into your food bank. Then those 20% food bank can help another population in need. So try to count all the scientific number, using that 20% to count how many biodiversity, how many forests, how many animals we're going to save. And those data is scientific data. So through the love, sacrifice, and we put into action, then we can be able to collect all the plastic, and then we have all the message, how many animals sacrifice their life every day. And through the saving those excess, I call excess food, we can reduce the hunger. We can create an opportunity for equal food access. So we need to put into action to think about every day what you can do when you eat your food. And of course, healthy diet, no overeat, and no necessity weight. So we can take care of our health and also take care of the mother nature and also support the biodiversity. So action.
Seems like we're all going for one-word answers.
No pressure.
So I'll give one, which is a form of action, which is from the Hindu tradition of service. That we are here to serve. We are here to serve one another. We are here to serve the earth. We're here to serve the divine or God or whatever we may call them. And through a spirit of service, we can sacrifice, we can live in love, we can have action. And Bob Dylan did say, you have to serve somebody. Whether you're serving the government or your partner or the taxman, we're always serving in the world. We're always having to give ourselves to someone or something else. And so this element of service is so intrinsic within the Hindu community, because if we're all serving, it means we're not accumulating, we're not over-consuming, we're not hoarding for ourselves, but we're seeing how can we help other people? What does the earth need of us right now? And I think that's such an important thing that we've actually just lost. I think we have it in all of our traditions. You know, we talk about helping others so much, but we've just lost it somehow. You know, as I think, Karina, as you said, we've become so individualistic. It's all about us. It's all about what I can do. But the spirit of service and love with sacrifice and action can be great. And I'm wondering what, Karina, word you're going to give us.
I don't know if I have one word. Well, connection would be a good one. Has that been used yet? No. I just am struck by that we're in this WWF pavilion, and in thinking about connection to nature, there's a good opportunity, there are wonderful experiences and perspectives to share from the change in human consciousness from that deeper connection to nature. So think for a moment to contextualize science. You know, we are called together in these COPs with these IPCC reports, and the scientists say, and the scientists tell us, and the scientists report are very common refrains. And science is of course very important, but one element of it is just careful observation of nature, the natural world, the laws of nature. So we should understand and communicate, I think, from other places that that's what we're talking about. We're not talking about some disconnected technocratic, database. We're talking about communion and observation and perception of the natural world of which we are a part. And it's been said that indigenous knowledge, the knowledge in traditional indigenous communities, is like a twin of science. I think Vine Deloria first said that, Native American theologian. And others have said similar things. And why is that? Well, of course, in some ways, it adds spiritual and cultural into it. So that's that connection with people. But in other ways, there is that careful observation. And so I've been thinking about how for example, the Winnemem Wintu people in Northern California call themselves the salmon people, connecting to the salmon, watching the salmon. And it doesn't necessarily mean, with all due respect to veganism, and thank you very much for that example and paradigm, doesn't necessarily mean they don't eat those salmon. They revere them, and they also take care of their habitat because they care so much about them and the connection to their own bodies as well as spirits. So anyway, that's one example. The Gwich'in people in the Arctic, who fought so hard against the oil and gas drilling expanding in the Arctic, in part behind the belief and values in the caribou, their connection to the caribou that are from that part of the Arctic, that they also hold to be connected to their people and who they are. And so I believe that with WWF bringing to attention these other living beings, these life forms, and allowing us the way to connect to them by understanding their well-being is part of the planetary well-being, is part of our own well-being on many levels, is really powerful. And I think we can learn from, as we do at Center for Earth Ethics, from those examples of those traditional indigenous peoples, and think that actually, this way of life that many of us are so used to in these highly industrialized developed nations and so on, it's not going so great for a lot of people with anxiety, with depression, with isolation and loneliness. There is a wonderful opportunity for faith and spiritual communities to really go for that connection, to bring us back into balance.
Thank you so much, Karina. Actually, when I reflect on my own journey in conservation, very similar, working with the First Nations Indigenous people in Northwest Canada who were sacrificing a lot to help try and protect a specific area of forest, and doing it in a very different way than I could possibly imagine. Revering salmon, revering when they did go hunting as well. It really helped change my beliefs and values and get something very deep inside me, which still drives me to this day. So there's an awful lot we can learn by working with others. And I think we've heard some amazing words here to connect. I'm going to try and get them all right. Sacrifice, love, service, and action as well. Another favorite word of mine too. So with that and that quite rich discussion, I'd like to leave a few minutes left to open it up to the audience. Perhaps you've got a question, a comment, or a word for one or any of the speakers here today. Do we have a question from the audience, and do we have a way to get a microphone to anybody in the audience as well? I'm just looking. A question. Please go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Husna Ahmed, and I've got a question. Can you hear me? I've got a question actually targeted at Karina, but I'm not sure if other panelists might want to jump in. You mentioned that finance wasn't that important, and you're talking from the US perspective. So my question to you is that those from the Global South are very conscious of the fact that they had no responsibility for climate change. And so my question to you is that, in terms of the concept of loss and damage and polluter pays, how do you, from your Center for Ethics, how do you sort of reconcile, that it's not important, but these concepts? Thank you.
That's a great question and a really important thing to point out. And let me. Well, first of all, I acknowledge that it's something that is a dimension of this conversation that I myself need to think more about. But I also want to clarify that I don't mean that finance isn't important, but I mean that a value system that confuses money with virtue or value is not a healthy one. But the finance aspects, and you mentioned loss and damage, and certainly from the developing world, and I believe we had a chance to meet, and I know you're from Bangladesh, correct? Yeah, such a powerful perspective that I believe from the Center for Earth Ethics and from an ethical analysis of this situation, it's absolutely imperative on those industrialized, developed nations to be acknowledging and acting on the reality that they have contributed more to this problem that is affecting the entire world by giving money, and this should also certainly apply to private sector actors, to the financing of these countries to adapt and also to be able to put in place those renewable energy technologies and systems that we know we all need to switch to for the future. And so that is a very important ethical imperative and a part of the ethical analysis, and I believe is connected to biodiversity as well as climate, because all of these places include habitat. We have to remember it's human beings as well as these other living species that we're looking after. So thank you for the question. And please, somebody else respond.
Any other responses? Dan, please go ahead.
May I just add literally one other word, and that is justice. Nothing that is said here should be read as contrary to the principle of justice. I think all of us are not suggesting that, if only we just sacrificed more, you don't need that money. You can figure it out on your own. That's not how this is meant to work. It's about all of us as a collective trying to understand the challenges we have and find just solutions to get out of them. And if that is what directs us, then we may indeed find that more financing than we expected is actually required, and different types of financing is required. But it's not with the goal of writing a check. It's with the goal of finding justice. The check may just be one of many different tools to help us arrive there.
Great, thank you. One more question.
Thank you. David Coleman, Eco Congregation Scotland. In Scotland, it's arguably the birthplace of the Enlightenment, which means for the last 200 years or so, anyone who talks as if they can have a relationship with the earth or with fellow creatures is treated as infantile, stupid, and always to be looked down on. And so in my work, I've looked at the spiritual resources that we have in our own traditions. There are treasures there which are set aside. And how can we be more thoroughly, more with integrity, people of the traditions we are, without coming across the problem that assertive religions very frequently encounter, which is that they end up causing wars and, causing more trouble in the first place? How do we, we saw it yesterday in George Square, that people can be fully people with their own tradition and yet bring that goodwill together. So we need to see the traditions as a resource for encountering crisis. But how do we keep an eye on that far side of it when we get too carried away and start killing each other?
Great, thank you. Does anybody want to craft a response? Please go ahead.
At the heart of every single tradition, or even no tradition, is the whole subject of spiritual values or human values or ethics, whatever terminology you choose to use. And it is this that binds us together as a civilization. And so how far to use the word civilization and civilized in today's world is a whole different topic. But the values are important. And so I think if we look at what unifies us and come back together to focus on those values, both personally as well as in our conversations, sometimes we're shy of using these words. And so if a few people start engaging others in conversations about this, I'm sure that it could spread further and further. And there would be no killing because we share the same foremost value of peace.
Thank you, Sister Jayanti. Please, Deborah.
From Buddha's perspective, we were looking to respect and gratefulness. We are grateful for what we have, and we are very grateful that we can be here together. And this kind of opportunity, every one of us, we can have different opinions. We all coming from different country. We born from different place. But through WWF, we have this connection because we respect each other. We respect your participation, and we're grateful for you spend the time with us. So Buddhists, we practice mercy of God, the mercy of compassion, the respect, gratitude, and love. So it's not easy to build it up a harmonious society. It's not easy for us to face the loss and damage. And it's not easy for us to see the earth is suffering. But we respect each other. We find the common narrow path, and we're heading to zero carbon tolerance. Then we support the survival for Mother Earth. So that's from respect and gratefulness.
Thank you so much, Deborah. We'll take one last question at the back there, and then I think we will have to wrap it up, unfortunately.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. My name's Chip Cummins. I'm with the American Renewable Energy Institute. And I wanted to, Corinna, you mentioned indigenous wisdom, and, I'm happy to say that I'm friends with the Bastida family, and today their young daughter, Xie, is going to be addressing the plenary and the world leaders. And so I think that your remarks are exactly right on the money in terms of recognizing indigenous wisdom as an essential part of the equation at this time, and that I wonder how, I would address to the entire panel, how can we, as modern civilization, begin to understand that they are the last firewall with the remaining nature in terms of the reserves, the reservations, traditional territory, but perhaps most importantly, indigenous wisdom. And I'm talking about all the indigenous peoples of the planet. And I think it's, well, I'd love to hear your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chip, and thank you for your wonderful work with renewable energy and also for leadership in lifting up the indigenous values. Well, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in the hands of indigenous peoples. And so, as has been said, it's critical to work with and learn from indigenous peoples. I also think that as some indigenous elders have said, and this is a very important part of the wisdom, is for all of us, we are all indigenous to the earth. And we all have within us that ability to connect to roots. The previous questioner had mentioned Scotland, and on both sides of my family, my mother and my father, and I'm honored my father is here, have Scottish ancestry. And it's the first time I've been to Scotland. And so I believe that as much as I might feel those roots ancestrally, I also live where I live, and I have a watershed, and I share the air and the water and the land, the soil with other species of beings around. And that is where I can also find my connection. And so I think one thing that we need to learn from indigenous peoples is that we can live ourselves in deep connection with place, with taking care and communing around us in that way. And if that kind of consciousness shifts, and this goes back to something that I mentioned at the beginning about how these commitments from nation states are very sometimes they rely on offsets, and we are all interconnected as a world, of course, and to plant trees on the other side of the world is a good thing, but we need people to be taking care of where they are now. And so that wisdom and strength of indigeneity goes deeper and broader in that way as well. So thank you for bringing it up.
Great, thanks, Corinna, and thanks for bringing us full circle now. So it's time to wrap up the discussion today. Just one final reflection. There are incredible opportunities and must-do things that world leaders and we can all take from the next 2 weeks. There is a must-do opportunity at COP15 in coming next year to put together that global biodiversity framework that Gopal mentioned, from an input from a faith perspective as well as many other perspectives as well, so that we can see a world where there is nature in recovery. We are in a nature positive world in the next decade, a more equitable world, and a world of carbon neutrality, of net zero emissions as well. That is the big aspiration that I think we all need to push towards. Finally, I'd like to thank our illustrious panel of speakers. Very rich, very deep conversation. We've touched on connectedness. We've touched on commitment, sacrifice. We've touched on love. We've touched on service. And we've also touched on action as well. So I think please do take those 5 words away. Reflect yourself on what you can draw inward from those for your own inner strength, and then take that strength out into the world here and beyond. And let's keep this conversation going. This is a very unusual kind of gathering for WWF, but in a conference like this, let's take it out there. Let's take our beliefs out and evangelize them and move the world to where we all know it must be and it has to be as well. With that, thank you very much, and please give a warm welcome, so a warm round of applause to our panel. Thank you. Thank you very much.